Hi everyone, I'm Mike and this is the Sunday Art Show. Now today we're going to be doing some open air painting, and I'm actually down at a little harbour called Cockwood Harbour, which is near Starcross in Devon. There's the finished piece and the view that inspired it. So it's kind of a unique little harbour actually. We'll come to that in a moment. Today I'm going to be using some interactive acrylics, some mixed media boards, and maybe a little bit of watercolour marker as well. So this narrow road that we're on here is actually a bridge, and then the road winds around past that pub I've just highlighted, and the pub is quite unique because you can actually sit on the harbour wall and have a drink. Beautiful environment, beautiful view as you can see. So this was fairly early on a summer's morning, but in Devon we don't always get the sunshine in the summer. But you can see it's started to come out a little bit now. And what I've begun to do there is just use my watercolour marker pen to put in the outlines of three of the little boats. Now obviously there are lots of boats in this harbour, but just chose to pick out three for the moment. As usual, I've got my decorator's palette and I've got my interactive acrylics on the go. So starting off with a flat brush, I start by blasting in a bit of sky and sweeping in some dark bluey grey clouds as well. Now the distant hills, which you can probably barely see on camera, that lie beyond the bridge and the embankment at the entrance to the harbour, that's Exmouth and sort of the neighbouring hills. Now what I'm shading in here is actually, it's an embankment and leads up to a bridge in the centre of the painting, and that's actually the railway line. So it's kind of, as I said, it's kind of a unique little harbour because to sail out of the harbour into the open water, you have to go underneath a railway bridge. So it's just a cool little thing to paint, really. Now, having blocked in the background, the sky and the embankment, I'm now tackling the water. So I'm keeping the surface of the painting very wet, going with a darker bluey grey green, and as you can see, sweeping in some horizontal brush strokes. You can see I'm just sat on the stone ramp which people use to bring their boats in and out of the harbour there, on a little trailer. And it was actually surprisingly comfortable, although I'm kind of lying on my side or sitting to my side there. It actually worked out pretty well. So you can see in the top left some cyclists just went past and a jogger. So it really was a nice little environment to spend an hour or so on an early summer's morning and paint away. Now, having covered the paper or the board with cold colours, I'm now bringing in a bit of warmth. And you can see I've blocked in one of the little boats there in the foreground. And now I'm tackling the light on the water, or at least the initial treatment of it. So earlier on, I used a paper towel to lift off some of the background paint in that region on the right, and now I'm just adding some pale highlights with a little bit of artistic license. So I'm popping in some yellows, and some kind of light blues, just to give a bit of variety to those highlights. Next, I revert to the second boat up in the top left of my painting there. And again, I'm just treating the forms very simply, just like I do with animals. I'm basically blocking in the silhouette, keeping in mind the direction of my brush strokes and the texture of the paint I'm putting down. And then I'm adding some shadows and highlights. And it's just a really nice, quick, efficient way to develop the form of what you're painting. Now, one thing to watch when you're painting outdoors is, if you remember, I did my initial sketch standing up, and then when I was blocking in some of the rest of the painting, I was sitting down. The danger there is, obviously, you've changed your perspective of the view, your vantage point. So I've returned to standing up here in order to go back and tackle the reflection on the orange boat and some of the other areas of the painting. Now I'm just adding a little hint of detail to the distant hills there. I'm not going to go in, there is actually a church on the horizon line, but I'm not going to include that. I'm not going to do much detail at all, but I just wanted to soften the watercolour marker pen line that I'd put down, because that was a little bit too hard a boundary between the sky and the landscape. But I'm So what I'm doing is just using my brush to hint at distant trees and the edges of fields. But back to the boats now, and adding some stronger highlights to that boat there on the left. So as you've probably gathered, this is kind of an impressionist treatment of the view. You know, I'm not going into a huge amount of detail, just trying to capture the feeling that you get when you sit here and look out across the water. I actually find the spray bottle is really useful, not just for spraying the surface of the board, and not just for reactivating the interactive acrylic. It's also really useful when using the mixing paint on the palette, because it allows you to just dilute your paint very gradually with a quick spray from the water bottle. I find it actually much better than just dipping my brush into a pot of water. So I'm adding to the highlights here. Now it's actually clouded over a little bit from what it was earlier. So I'm using a little bit of memory, but just below where the train is passing now, the water there, you probably can't see it on camera, but it's almost a continuous band of highlight. So I've added a little bit more texture than there actually is to my painting, but I was careful to keep the marks small. Now I reverted back to the Payne's Grey watercolour marker here, just to pop in that little post. But for the railings along the edge of the railway line, I want them a little bit fainter and a little bit more impressionist style, so I'm just using my flat brush to pop those in, and having changed the colour, I do a similar treatment for the railings going across the bridge. Now at this stage the composition's looking a little bit empty, and because of that there's something of a lack of depth to the painting, and as we mentioned earlier, there are lots and lots of boats in the harbour, and I just selected 3. So what I decided to do was include some of the boats which are actually over by the railway bridge there, and you can see just to the right of where I'm drawing at the moment I've put a couple of very small boats in, and now I'm adding a further 3. And what that's going to do is going to help lead the eye from the foreground of the painting, which is going to be painted in, the orange boat is quite bright compared to the rest of the painting and painted in more detail. Then we've got the second and third boats, which I've dealt with already, and what I'm doing now is popping in the distant boats. You can see I've put a couple of others below the right hand green embankment. So we're just filling those in more or less in silhouette and in a cold grey colour, just to push them back into the distance a little bit. And I will add, I've added some highlights, as you can see.
Oh, you should, it's good fun.
I'm just chatting to a guy who came along to watch.
I've seen several people here sketching, but I must say yours is the best so far.
Oh, thank you.
So he very kindly complimented my painting, so that added to my morning. That brought a smile to my face. So I'm just adding a few little highlights underneath those distant boats there, where there's a little bit of reflection in the water. But again, I've done the most detail in the reflections for the boats nearest us, and then there's very little detail in the distant stuff. Now I'm back to my watercolour marker now. I think this is a burnt umber I'm using, and I also used an orange, just to add in a few little details of some of the scratches and the marks on the hull of the boat, some of the rope which is trailing over the side of the hull, and working on top of the acrylic with the watercolour marker, it's no problem at all. And it's also perfect just to sweep in the mooring ropes on these other boats. But what I do is, you'll see I do it here on this one and also on the next one I do. It's good to keep some of those lines broken, especially as they go off into the distance, because that helps to create the illusion that light is catching on a wet part of the rope. A little bit of seaweed dangling off the mooring rope there. And then I also decided to put a couple of little buoys in. I know in the States you pronounce that buoy, but that we say buoy over here, even though we spell it the same way. So the little floats that are used with the mooring ropes. Now there are some kind of plastic containers inside this foremost boat, so I decided to include those. But there's a look at the complete painting, and as usual I'll pop a link in the description, so if you want you can check it out on the website and zoom in on the image. But I hope you enjoyed this little open air adventure with me. As usual, please remember to subscribe, and if you have any questions at all, then obviously ask me in the comments below and I'll be happy to answer. But in the meantime, I'll see you next Sunday for the next episode of the Sunday Art Show. Thanks again for watching.